She says, Gary, stop. Just stop right now. Stop apologizing. I've had a ball here. I've had a lot of fun. And my daughter told me how wonderful you people are. And let me just say this, it really feels good to be here. And
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to being here. Go figure. I thought for sure the vibe was dead on arrival. And yet the team pulled it off. So the culture took care of it.
Tips from Trestle is brought to you by eMenu Choice Point of Sale, Bizox AI, and Clark Pro. Welcome to Tips from Trestle, the Senior Living Food and Hospitality Podcast. This podcast explores the senior living industry with a unique focus on food, hospitality, and the community experience. I'm your host, Aaron Fish. My goal for this podcast: educate, inform, and inspire leaders in senior living. How? By bringing the resident and customer experience to the front of mind in our industry. We should bring the passionate spirit of food and hospitality to everything that we do and everyone we serve each and every day. So what are we waiting for? Let's get to it. Today on Tips from Trestle, I'm joined by Gary Solomonson. Gary is the founder of Virtical Learning Systems, which offers coaching and tutorials for senior living communities. With over 45 years of experience in the senior living industry, Gary is an expert in sales and marketing and cultural research and has worked with many operators, such as the Goodman Group, supporting over 80 communities in 10 states, as well as a founder with Grand Living. Over the course of his career, he has consulted with hundreds of communities, and I'm excited to have him here today. So, Gary, welcome into the podcast.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. It's great to be here.
Yes, I'm excited. We've been working together in different groups and communicating for a while now. And so I'm glad we were able to get our calendars together to talk. And so you are probably the most experienced person I know in the industry. And so I am curious to get a little bit more about your story on how you got into senior living and why it's been your career for such a long time.
Well, thank you. I really began my first actual involvement in the senior living sector when I was in grade school. Fourth or fifth grade, I think, were the first years that I got involved. My parents were volunteers for the Salvation Army, and they would always visit people who were in rest homes. We didn't have the term senior living back in the 50s, but we would visit the rest homes and the nursing homes. And I really had a lot of fun because I ended up being the entertainment. My parents would have me help carry things in, but the residents loved having this crazy little Norwegian kid, in the room talking and visiting and helping his parents. And I've never looked back. And I continued in the field during high school, during college, during graduate school, and even started to focus on it when I began my PhD work. And then I continued to pursue a professional career in it. And it's been a lot of fun.
I look back on my time and I sit here and go, well, for me, it's been 22 years. And I think, man, it's crazy that I've been in this space this long. And that when I got into it, it felt like it was such a new industry. But to hear your story and go, well, no, I just happen to think that because that's where I came in at. And so just the journey and the growth of senior living has been amazing to watch. And I can only imagine your perspective. One of the things we're going to talk about was a little bit about what your company does, right? The way you approach training and development and how things look in a community. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the things your company focuses on, right? You have your 3 modules. You call it macro, micro, and mentor. And so given all of your experience, I'd love for you to tell why this is the approach you use when working with senior living communities.
Sure. This has evolved. My partner, Nancy Goldman, and I, and my wife, Julie, and son, we've been working on developing a platform for doing coaching and training. And given the nature of the industry, as much as I would like to simply do long, wonderful workshops, which I call our macro learning, the reality is all of my clients that I work with now, most of them have very limited time available for learnings. But with that in mind, our macro learning are our four signature services. The first one is collaborative sales coaching and research. The second one is dementia care and sales, which is a very special field for me. I actually specialize in the dementia field, working with families and training salespeople to work with families who are blended families. That's a very complicated challenge for many salespeople.
I can only imagine the dynamics that come with that. I mean, my wife is part of a blended family. And so thinking about those dynamics and how it could affect someone with dementia, that super specialized. That's an interesting thing to hear about.
There are a lot of wonderful people in the dementia care field, and I know many of them. I've read their books, I've spent time learning from them. And I just decided a couple of years ago to specialize in the blended family and working with salespeople who work with those. The third area is sales assessments and cultural vibe research. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then the fourth one is developing sales leads via outreach marketing and networking. So those are the macro learning opportunities. The micro are simply shorter sessions based on that material. And our mentor learning is based on what we call our blue and green papers. If you remember, in days past, we talked about white papers in education and business.
Yep.
And I've created blue and green papers given our colors for the logo and so forth. And those are basically papers where we discuss via the tutorials that I've created for those. So that's sort of the macro, micro, and mentor platform.
Yeah. And the reason I was asking about that is because I knew it would draw out the thing I really wanted to talk about and dig into a little bit more, which is the cultural vibe research. You mentioned that as some of your training and that you do the blue and green papers about that area. And it was interesting to me because I think the first time I even heard you talking about this was when I read your monthly newsletter, Vertical Logic. And I think it was the December issue that came out. And
Yeah,
you put in there that the headline was, I have to get this right, a community's vibe, the silent differentiator, 70% of the time culture and vibe decides the sale.
right.
So it was funny to me because I think about Gary's got all this experience. He's probably got some cool approaches because of his tenure in the industry. And here you are talking about the vibe in a community. And I thought, I've got to talk to him about that. Right. And so, especially because what we do and what we talk about on this podcast is what is the community experience like for a resident? And so I want to dive into that. So tell us from your perspective, what makes up this senior living community vibe that we're talking about?
Okay. A community's vibe is that emotional feeling that's created in the kind of the heart and the mind of the prospect based on what they see, what they hear, and what they feel during a visit. And we teach clients about the 5 touch points that make up a senior living community's vibe. The 5 general touch points or categories are: number 1 are the first impressions. That first impression from the time you park your car, walk into the community,
Yeah.
open up the door, go through the check-in, meet the receptionist, and so forth. There are first impressions all along the way as you tour the community and so on and so forth. Second are the people. What kind of things do you feel and experience and see with the residents and the staff, especially their energy?
Mm.
I'm always amazed in debriefing interviews I do in my research how much attention prospects pay to the energy
Yeah.
and concentration of staff. The third one is the culture, how it feels to live here. Again, in my cultural research, One of the most fascinating things that I've been taught by the people who are residents and teach me about what a culture vibe is, many of them have expressed that during the course of time, the cumulative experiences create that vibe that people take into the decision-making process. And what they have told me that why that's important to them as they think about that, because they transfer that into the notion, I'm hoping this is what it will feel like to live here.
Mm. Yeah.
And so that's very critical. And the fourth one is the physical environment, how clean, comfortable, interior design, lighting, temperature, and all those things. And then the fifth is focused on staff responsiveness and resident engagement. And here we look at the sense of authenticity that they see, they hear, and they feel.
Yeah.
And that's so important. So when prospects visit, they may not articulate these details, but they feel them. And if the energy is positive, if it's welcoming, if it's alive, they'll be more inclined to say, I can see myself living here. If the atmosphere is sterile, passive, institutional, they'll hesitate. Nothing will kill a positive vibe quicker than a sense of hesitation. And so that's very important. So that's an overview of how we deal with the touch points that create the positive vibe.
Yeah. When I hear you listing them off, I think some people may hear this and go, yeah, this is kind of obvious things. But I think that the point that you make that I think is so important is that while maybe some of it seems more obvious than not, how often do we overlook these things, right? Like I think all the time about my experience as an executive director. The first thing I did when I showed up to the community was I drove around the community.
Sure. Yep.
And then when I got out of my car, I then walked around the community, right? And so literally like thinking like with the vibe of, does my community look like it's supposed to? How does my staff respond? Like, am I creating the right place for people to live and work? You know, all of these things are individually important, but I think the way you've combined them all together really, really makes a ton of sense. And I love that you kind of wrap it up with that sense of authenticity. So,
I think it's important to recognize too that each one of those 5 general touch points that I mentioned, we do deep dives into 3 specific areas and really break it down much more. And I think while it's common sense, drilling down into the very essence of what creates the vibe and how critical it is has been a lot of fun. And I know it's been helpful for many of the folks that we've worked with.
yeah. As I think about all of the various conversations we've had, like your experience as a sales and marketing expert, you are such a great storyteller. You're able to take a concept and really paint a picture with it. And so I think to help us better understand kind of what you're talking about with the nuts and bolts of this positive community vibe, I'd love for you to tell us about a time where you saw this help either you or a team you were working with really sell the community and create that atmosphere and experience for the resident and prospect.
Technology continues to drive changes in senior care, and that includes food service. eMenu Choice is an award-winning point-of-service application for managing the dining function in senior living communities. This mobile, touchscreen-enabled software enhances the dining experience for residents while streamlining processes for staff. The flexibility and functionality of eMenu Choice makes it an effective solution for any type of senior living environment, from independent and assisted living to skilled nursing facilities. It works for production kitchens or restaurant-style service with options for per meal or a la carte pricing, and accommodates a variety of payments, including bill to account, meal credits, and credit cards. Created by a senior care provider with more than a century of experience serving older adults, eMenu Choice eliminates communication barriers between staff and residents while enabling person-centered choices and greater resident satisfaction. E-Menu Choice, transforming dining for senior living.
Sure, I'd love to. I think I'll share a story about an experience I had in San Diego, California, when I was vice president at the Goodman Group. In Los Alamitos, we had this assisted living and nursing home, and it was a lot of fun to be there. And when I traveled as vice president of sales and marketing and new development, I generally give the sales director a day off. And I did it for two reasons. Most of the time, it's always like, the vice president for sales and marketing coming, they get uptight. I'd give them the day off so they could go out and have fun, and I'd work the floor for them. And so it created kind of a fun cultural experience.
Yeah.
So I was in Los Alamitos, got a call from a daughter whose mother, Esther, wanted to move from the Midwest to San Diego to be close to her daughter. Her daughter's home was just blocks from our community. And one of the fun things we did at Los Alamitos was in the early morning, sometimes there were a lot of local people who would run past the facility or go for daily walks. And we'd stand out there with these small bottles of water and we'd hand them to them. And we did it so people would see that this is an alive, fun place to be. We're connected with the community and so forth. So anyway, the daughter said that she and her mother, Esther, were going to come visit with us. I said, great, bring her over and we'll give her a tour. Well, the mom showed up, but the daughter didn't. The daughter had something come up with work, but the mother was there, Esther was there, and she showed up 15 minutes early. Now, all of us in senior living know that seniors never show up late, right? They show up early, an hour, a half hour or more. And Lord love them. And I was 15 minutes late. So the poor lady sat there for a half hour waiting. And when I came out to meet her and welcome her to my office, I could tell she was miffed. Okay.
Yeah.
And thought, oh boy, I'm going to be pushing a boulder uphill now, so forth. But I offered her tea. We sat down. We started to visit. I started to listen to her story. And then all of a sudden, there was an emergency, a big ruckus out in the lobby. Here, a gentleman had fallen, hurt himself, was flat on his back. The receptionist came in panicking. I politely excused myself from Esther to go deal with this situation. And it was obvious it was going to take a few minutes. So Jeannie, who was our activities director, I motioned to her to go visit with Esther, which she did. And at that time, Jeannie was teaching watercolor painting class in the activity room. And it was almost a half hour or so before I could get back to Esther. So when I walked into the activity room, there was Esther and Jeannie sitting in front of a canvas, and Esther was starting to work on a painting on the canvas. And I said, well, gosh, I hate to interrupt, Esther, but should we go in and I'll finish listening to your story and I can give you a tour? And she says, do I have to? I said, no, you don't have to. She said, I would like to stay for the rest of the class. And I thought, well, okay, that's fine. We'll do it. So fast forward, I finally walked in and she was at a point where we could continue our conversation. All of a sudden, there was this big hug, and Jeannie had invited Esther to next week's painting class. We talk about serendipity and a silver cloud.
Right.
Our cloud experience, it was there. So then I said, well, let's go in the dining room and we'll have hot tea. Yours is cold now from when we sat down. And wouldn't you know, we weren't talking more than 3 minutes, and the executive director came in and with a somber look on her face, and she said, Gary, I hate to interrupt you, but the boss is on the phone and he wants to talk to you. Of course, the first thing I think, oh gosh, what haven't I done? What did I do wrong? I never have that experience. But at that point, John was planning to come out to Los Alamitos to meet with us, my boss at the time. And of course, he was always insistent to talk and get plans made. So while I was on that call, our chef and our dining room host had sat down with Esther. And as I came to pick her up now and take her on a tour, she walked out, gave each of them a hug. Now mine's full. Jeannie's gotten a hug. Those guys have got hugs. And I thought, I'm never going to get a hug from her. Oh, but she was so happy to walk out with the cookies. And when we got back to my office so I could give her collateral material and so forth, she simply looked at me as I started to apologize. She says, Gary, stop. Just stop right now. Stop apologizing. I've had a ball here. I've had a lot of fun. And my daughter told me how wonderful you people are. And let me just say this, it really feels good to be here. And
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to being here. Go figure. I thought for sure the vibe was dead on arrival, and yet the team pulled it off. So the culture took care of it.
Yeah. And I think the thing in that story that the listeners can take away isn't that Gary maybe dropped the ball 3 or 4 different times with Esther, but really it's more that it was a community process. Everybody was engaged. You know, you talked about activities, you talked about maintenance, you talked about the executive director, the chef. And when I think about what I tell clients and operators about what's so important in the community experience is that has to be involved and everyone has to be engaged. And without that, the community just isn't going to be the best it can be.
If I could add a footnote, one thing she did say that meant a great deal to me and why I saw it as a silver lining in that cloud, she said, I loved sitting by and watching everybody respond to the gentleman who had fallen and to watch multiple people come and professionally and positively truly care about that person.
I think those, like you said, when you talk about, it's not just how clean is the place, but what's the energy from the people, the residents and the staff? What does it feel like to live there? Like how responsive are the staff? I mean, all those bullet points of what you say are important about creating a vibe is there in that story. And so I think that paints a great picture. So when you are working with a manager or a supervisor and trying to get them to understand all of this, what is your approach to coaching them to get them to understand the best way to talk about wants and interests and needs as a part of this whole entire process?
Sure. We put a lot of emphasis on all of us, regardless of our role, understanding the unique qualities and differences between a want, an interest, and a need. And one of the things in our coaching that we focus on, whether it's training or coaching a new salesperson who's going to work part-time on weekends to cover for the marketing director or backup sales, that there are unique differences between a want, an interest, and a need. And that's why part of our brand is winning by knowing, WIN being wants, interests, and needs. In the case of Esther, she needed to find a place to live.
Yeah.
And she wanted to live someplace that was active and so on and so forth. But what I learned about Esther, that most of her life, she had wanted to learn how to be a painter, an artist. And always as you look at the blend of wants, interests, and needs, regardless of whether you're a prospect or a staff person, it's always the blend, but one of those items will eventually be the driving factor in the decision-making process. And for her, it was a very strong interest in wanting to be active and to do watercolors.
Yeah. So, we've talked about the vibe. You've painted this great, I love the story about Esther and how she experienced that positive community vibe. If someone listening to this wanted to know how to do that or learn how to do it the way that you've kind of laid out, how would they go about doing that?
We would welcome them to give me a call, and I'll gladly share with them information about the 5 30-minute tutorials that we've created to learn about this. And our coaching is collaborative coaching. One of the things that's so important to me is to do these tutorials, to conduct these tutorials in a collaborative format with their supervisor or their director. That way I stay within the boundaries of their mission and their values, but at the same time, we drill down within each of the 5 tutorials, the obvious, but more importantly, the subtle aspects of what creates a vibe. And so they're welcome to give me a call.
I'd love for you to go ahead and as we wrap up here, how can people reach out and connect with you?
Just email me at Gary at Virtical, and Virtical is spelled VIRTICAL.live. The word vertical spelt that way is what they call a portmanteau. It's a combination of 2 words, vertical and virtual. And I only work virtually. And so.
No, that's great. Love it. So, Gary, this has been a great conversation. I love this idea of getting the right positive vibe in your community to create the right experience, not just for the prospects, but it's going to pass it along to the residents and the staff. And so the goal is, I think, for every operator that listens to this podcast is that we want to go out there and be able to pass the vibe check.
Yeah.
Thanks again for joining me today on Tips from Trestle.
Hey, thank you, Aaron. Nice to be with you.
So there it is, everybody. Another one in the books. Thanks again for tuning in. Please follow, like, and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to follow us on social media at Tips from Trestle. You can also learn more about the work I do by following me on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and even TikTok. And be sure to check out Trestle Hospitality Concepts at www.trestlehospitalityconcepts.com. I'm your host, Aaron Fish, and this has been another episode of Tips from Trestle.